It's late afternoon, you can hear the wind. The birds are too smart to be around, although you can hear a few of the noisy miners causing issues. Today I want to equate the public housing struggle with doing a Bradbury. Now there are certain terms that are very familiar to some Australians, not all. Things like Bob's your uncle. And I think the newest phrase that has become quite commonly used is doing a Bradbury. Who was Bradbury? Well, Stephen Bradbury was the first Australian to win a gold medal at the Winter Olympics, the history of the Winter Olympics, and he won a gold medal in 2002 for ice skating. Now, Stephen had been involved in ice skating for over 25 years before he won that gold medal. He had many injuries, some were life-threatening. He was nearly rendered a quadriplegic on one occasion, nearly bled to death on another occasion, but he continued that struggle. And in the Winter Olympics in 2002, he won an unlikely victory. There were 5 finalists in the final. He was one of them. He had a strategy because he realised he wasn't as fast as the first 4. He had a strategy of following close behind in case there was an accident. And it's not unusual in ice skating, especially speed skating, for the skaters to fall over and bring other skaters around them to the floor. And what actually happened is the type of thing you read in fairy tales. The 4 skaters in front of him fell over and he just skated past and won the gold medal. So doing a Bradbury has become an analogy for doing basically the impossible. Now, the public housing struggle has been a particularly difficult struggle in this country over the last 20 years. Now, public housing was first introduced after World War II because returned servicemen and women who had fought overseas, who'd seen their comrades die and injured, demanded a roof over their heads. If you look at pictures of Melbourne post-World War II, you'll see returned servicemen and women camping. That's right, camping in tents in the MCG in the Botanical Gardens. And this was the impetus for the creation of public housing. Now, public housing is based on 2 principles. They're very simple principles. And those principles are about security of tenure. Not leases which you renew every year or 2 years or every 3 years, but security of tenure. As long as you look after the property and pay your rent and you want to live there, you're able to live there. The second very important principle in public housing is percentage of income. Not like mortgage repayments or rental repayments in the commercial world or the residential marketplace. It's about percentage of income. So if you require a roof over your head and you can't access private housing because you're limited income, you pay 25% of your rent, of your income as your rent. That's 25%. So these are the 2 basic tenets. Security of tenure, 25% of income. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a concerted effort to privatise the public housing sector, and Victoria has been leading the way, followed by New South Wales, in that endeavour. In the 1970s, when over 15% of Victorians lived in public housing, many in spot purchased housing around regional Victoria and the city, is now reduced to less than 3%. And during that period, we've seen concerted efforts by both Liberal Party governments and Labor Party governments, especially in Victoria and New South Wales, do everything they can to privatise the public housing sector. And the housing affordability crisis we now have is directly related to the monopolisation of the residential property market by commercial interests. There is no public housing sector to speak of, and what little public housing is left is now being destroyed through lack of maintenance, and we've seen a variety of terms which have been used, and a variety of accommodations which the state governments have made with the private commercial sector to provide so-called affordable community social housing. The situation has got to such an extent in Victoria that the social community housing waiting list has now been incorporated into the public waiting list, as if there's no difference. Obviously there is a significant difference. Public housing provides security of tenure and is based on you using 25% of your income to pay for a roof over your head. Now, many people today who are in the residential marketplace find they're paying 30, 40, 50, 60, even 70% of their income to meet mortgage repayments or meet escalating rental repayments. Just an extraordinary situation. So in a country with so much spare land as Australia, we now have a housing affordability crisis, and that housing affordability crisis is not just due to the monopolisation of housing, especially residential housing, by the private sector, but opening up the Australian residential marketplace to foreign investors, as well as providing tax advantages for people who own more than one house through negative gearing, which means that if you make a loss because you've got a high mortgage on that particular property and the rent doesn't cover the mortgage, you can claim that loss against your taxable income. What other country on earth, if not the universe, has such an extraordinary policy where people who own more than one house and able to rent that accommodation out can get a tax refund while expanding their housing empire? Now, we must be almost the most stupid people on the planet to let governments open up the residential, not commercial, but the residential marketplace to private investors and to people, to private investors, both local and overseas, who gain advantages through investing in the residential property market, taxation advantages. And what we've seen is an escalation, a gross escalation of property. I'll give you an example. A property I'm familiar with in 1918, I lost the plot there, didn't I? In 1982, a property in Richmond, an inner city Melbourne suburb, 3-bedroom property on a minuscule block with no garden to speak of, on a list, sold for $42,500. In 2017, that same property, no renovations done to the property, the same property sold for, I think, $1.35 million. That's a 40-fold increase in the price of housing in the inner city, and 20 or 30-fold increase outside the inner city, where the average housing price anywhere in Australia can range anywhere between $700,000 to over $1 million. You know, in the old days, if you won Tats Lotto, you were set for life. Today, if you win Tats Lotto, you'll be lucky to buy a 3-bedroom home within 10 kilometres of a major city CBD. That's how ridiculous the situation has got. And that's why public housing has always been so important in regulating the commercial marketplace. If there is no public housing sector, there is no competition in the residential property market. If there is no competition, there is an escalation of prices. And what we've seen with the increase in interest rates, although people who are paying off their home are now paying the burden for this country's corporate profitability, we now find that people who are renting in the private marketplace whose rent is not fixed at a percentage of income are paying extraordinary rents to meet the mortgage repayments, the increasing mortgage repayments of investors. So as I said at the beginning, there are two principles to look at when governments, whether it's state or federal, talk about housing assistance, community housing, social housing, affordable housing, and that is security of tenure. That means being able to live in the same place. Not for a year, not for 2 years, but for decades. Not concerned about being evicted if you pay 25% of your income or don't trash the place. Having the ability to send your children to the same schools, for them to form the same friendships, for them to join the same sporting clubs, just like people do when they send their children to private schools. That's security of tenure. If there is no security of tenure, if like affordable housing, this is a ridiculous situation, and I'll go through this in Victoria, which I'm familiar with. Affordable housing in Victoria means the government, the state government, subsidises private investors to build housing, which they then lease out at about 80% of the rental for that particular area for short periods, maybe a year, maybe 2, maybe 3. No security of tenure, no accessibility based on 25% of your income. So all it is, it's a little bit like most private-public partnerships. It's a cash cow for the private corporations, the private building firms that are involved in building that residential property. Now let's look at community and social housing. That is now being raised as the next big thing as far as housing affordability and housing accommodation is concerned, especially for people on low incomes. We've seen that the public housing struggle has been deserted apart from small groups like our own, groups like Defend and Extend Public Housing, Everybody's Business, and the list goes on, and to a significant degree been supported by the Victorian. To their credit, the Victorian Greens, and to a lesser extent the federal Greens, have actually taken up the public housing struggle. But the normal organisations you would have expected to be fighting for public housing, all the religious-based groups, the charities, are no longer interested in public housing because they've realised that privatisation is a gold mine. We saw it with employment services, unemployment services. The Salvation Army, a religious-based organisation, is now the greatest provider of unemployment services to the community. In the past, over 20 years ago, it was a federal government responsibility, but that was outsourced and privatised. We see with the social security sector that many of the programs which used to be carried out by federal and state governments have now been sourced out to private organisations, and many of these private organisations are religious based. And what this has done is given them a superhighway to the federal treasury and the state treasury. We've seen the creation of bureaucracies, self-serving bureaucracies in these organisations, which now provide services which have been privatised by state and federal governments. That doesn't mean that these services are fit for purpose, as we're led to believe. And we've seen the same thing happen in the public housing sector with the privatisation of public housing and the giving away of titles and the bank guarantees and the financial guarantees provided to the banking sector by the state governments. We now see that these organisations have moved holus bolus into the provision of what's laughingly described as low-cost housing. There's only one problem. Public housing is like going to a public hospital. If you have an operation that needs to be done that can wait, you wait. If you're hit by a car, you have multiple injuries, you're flown by to the local public hospital, and you'll get, in the majority of cases, quite good treatment because you've got an acute need. That's what the public is about. It's not about cherry picking. If you then look at the private hospital sector, they cherry pick their customers. Obviously they cherry pick people who've got private health insurance, but more importantly, they cherry pick the more profitable aspects of medical care. The harder medical care still is provided by the public health sector. It's the same with community, social and public housing. Public housing, when we had a public housing list of its own, public housing was directed at providing care, housing for those who have the greatest need. Social and community housing organisations pick and choose who their clients are. Pick and choose. And only that, clients in community and social housing do not have security of tenure like they do in public housing. Not only don't they have security of tenure, they pay more than 25% of their income, up to 30%. And when it comes to repairs, it's almost as difficult getting repairs in the community and social housing sector than the public housing sector, which has been consciously wound down and starved of funds, especially funds to provide basic maintenance. So governments can say, look at that rundown housing estate, and then privatise that rundown housing estate, create what's called a community private partnership or a public-private partnership where only 10 to 15% of the homes that are created are allocated to public housing, the rest to community, social and private housing. So don't be fooled. Every time you hear somebody talk about housing affordability, every time you hear about government intervention in the housing market to improve housing affordability, ask yourself two questions. Does it, like public housing, provide security of tenure? The fact that you don't have to apply and reapply and apply and reapply every year to continue to live in that accommodation. And if it doesn't provide security of tenure, it is not fit for purpose. And then ask, is the rent based on a percentage of income, or is it based on commercial rents minus about 10 or 15%? If it's not based on a percentage of income of around 25%, it is not fit for purpose. For far too long, people have misunderstood these terms, and they've misunderstood them for a very good reason, because private organisations which provide community social housing, and governments at the state and to a lesser extent the federal level, have muddied the waters regarding the role of public housing because it suits their privatisation agenda. Now, Mr. Stephen Bradbury, who I mentioned at the beginning of this YouTube publication, was not an overnight sensation. He had been ice skating for over a quarter of a century. He had won world championships in the past. He had sustained severe injuries, cervical fractures, trauma, massive blood loss pursuing his sport. But eventually he won that Olympic gold medal, the first Olympic winter medal won by an Australian in 2002. Public housing is like, the public housing struggle is like Mr. Bradbury's struggle. We can do a Bradbury because community housing, social housing, affordable housing will all fall over because they cannot provide the two basic pillars of affordable housing, and that is housing security, security of tenure, and rent which is fixed at a percentage of income, normally 25%. So if you're involved in the public housing struggle, get out there, do a Bradbury, let's win this one.